Before anything existed in written form, before the familiar stories of prophets and kings were placed into the pages we know today, there were older records that moved quietly through ancient civilizations. These records carried descriptions of angels who acted before the creation of nations, laws delivered through supernatural messengers, and events that shaped humanity long before the rise of Rome or the spread of Western Christianity. These writings were not hidden because they were insignificant. They were hidden because they revealed too much. They described moments when the spiritual world crossed into the human world with clarity that later generations considered dangerous. They contained knowledge that early Christians respected, but later leaders rejected. And while most of these writings disappeared from the Western world, one nation kept them safe. One nation preserved them for thousands of years with a sense of responsibility that did not break, even under pressure from powerful empires. Today, as we look at these forgotten texts, we enter a world that challenges everything many people believe they know about biblical history. Imagine starting a journey not from what is commonly taught, but from what was removed. Imagine learning that the Bible used by millions contains only part of the story. Imagine discovering that in another part of the world, a Bible exists with not 66 books, but 88, and that the extra books are not myths or commentaries, but full ancient scriptures that were once respected by early followers of God. These books include detailed accounts of the first generations of humanity, descriptions of angels who guided or rebelled, visions of the final judgment, and explanations about how corruption entered the world. They answer questions that people still ask today. What exactly happened between heaven and earth in the earliest times? Who were the beings that interacted with humans before the Great Flood? Why did the ancient world experience such extreme spiritual activity? These questions are not new. They were asked thousands of years ago, and answers were written, preserved, and transmitted. The mystery is not that the answers exist. The mystery is why so many of them were removed. The first 30 seconds of this exploration matter because they open a door into a world that challenges the limits of ordinary understanding. Most viewers have heard of the Bible. Most have heard about the Old Testament and the New Testament, but very few have heard about the Ethiopian canon. Very few know that early Christians once read books that spoke openly about the fall of spiritual beings, the rise of their children, and the instructions given to humanity by angels. These same books describe visions so intense and so precise that early church leaders feared they would distract believers from the simpler message they wanted to teach. But Ethiopia did not fear this. Ethiopia believed that all of these writings were important because they reflected the full reality of the spiritual world, and because Ethiopia remained independent from the councils that shaped Western doctrine. It kept the full canon that once existed before political decisions removed these texts. From most traditions, long before the Western world defined its Bible, ancient communities understood that their history was connected to supernatural events. The earliest followers of God believed in angels who taught, angels who rebelled, angels who warned, and angels who judged. These ideas were not strange to them. They were part of their world view. They saw the spiritual realm and the human realm as connected. They believed that corruption and knowledge were brought to humanity by spiritual beings who acted against God. They believed that the universe had a structure governed by divine order. They believed that prophets like Enoch and others received messages from heavenly messengers. These beliefs were preserved through many generations, but the writings that explained them were slowly removed from circulation. Some were labeled as dangerous, some were dismissed as too mystical, some were rejected because they emphasized laws and customs that the early church wanted to move away from. But Ethiopia did not erase them. Ethiopia preserved them exactly as its ancestors received them. This means that the Ethiopian canon is not an expanded Bible. It is the surviving form of a Bible that once existed before Western edits. It is the closest thing we have to the original collection of sacred writings used by early Jewish and Christian communities. These writings include details that challenge modern interpretations. They explain the origin of the giants mentioned briefly in Genesis. They describe the Watchers, angels who descended to earth and broke divine instruction. They reveal the warnings that God delivered through angels long before Moses received the law. They describe how time was originally measured by a calendar given through the heavens. And they show how early believers understood the coming of a messianic figure hundreds of years before the birth of Jesus. These writings do not replace the familiar scriptures. They deepen them. It is important for viewers to understand that these books were not banned because they were false. They were removed because they were considered too complex, too supernatural, or too dangerous for the structured belief system that political leaders wanted to create. The councils that shaped the Western Bible did not simply choose the most truthful books. They chose the books that best supported the doctrines they wanted to promote. Anything that seemed too mystical, too connected to Jewish law, or too different from the image of the faith they wanted to build was set aside. This does not mean that the familiar Bible is incomplete in message. It means that it is incomplete in scope. The Ethiopian Bible preserves the missing context that explains many mysteries found in the Western Bible. Now consider this. The same early Christians who quoted Enoch and Jubilees would not recognize the modern Western Bible. They would ask why so many of the texts they considered essential were missing. They would ask why the stories of angelic actions were removed. They would ask why the detailed history of the early world disappeared. They would ask why the writings that shaped their worldview were labeled as forbidden. These books were part of their spiritual identity. They were important for understanding the cosmic conflict that still continues today, and they were important for interpreting prophecy. The Ethiopian Bible keeps these writings alive. It allows us to see the Bible the way early believers saw it. It helps us understand their perspective, and it reveals that the spiritual world was always understood to be active, structured, and deeply connected to human history. As you follow this exploration, remember that you are entering knowledge that survived against all odds. These writings were nearly erased from the world, yet they remained alive in one nation that refused to let them be removed from its faith. Ethiopia protected them through wars, invasions, and cultural pressure. Ethiopia kept them when other nations abandoned them. Ethiopia believed that their value was too great to lose. And now, for the first time in many people's lives, these texts are being rediscovered, studied, and recognized. Again, before we continue, I want to ask you something specific. In the comments, write the word preserved if you believe these ancient books were protected for a reason. This helps grow this community of people who want to learn deeper truths. And if you have not done it yet, feel welcome to join us by subscribing so you can continue exploring every part of this journey without missing anything. New revelations are coming, and you will want to stay with us as we uncover them step by step. From the moment ancient people looked toward the rising sun and believed that God was guiding the world through unseen hands, there has always been one question that shaped human history. Which nation carried the earliest truth? Many cultures claimed special knowledge, but only one lineage traced its spiritual identity back to a moment when heaven and earth came together in a way that changed the destiny of an entire kingdom. To understand how the Ethiopian Bible preserved books that disappeared everywhere else, we must return to a world long before modern borders existed. long before the Western Church shaped doctrine, and long before the Bible took the familiar form we know today. This story does not begin with the church councils. It begins with a spiritual connection so old that it reaches back to the days of Solomon, the Queen of Sheba, and the powerful kingdom that would become one of the first nations on earth to embrace Christianity. The first 30 seconds of this journey need to open a different door, a door that leads to ancient Ethiopia, a land where the spiritual traditions of Israel took root long before Rome gained influence. Ethiopia was not a follower of Western ideas. It was a guardian of older traditions. It preserved the connection between God and his people in a way that survived wars, invasions, and attempts to erase its identity. And because Ethiopia remained independent from Western councils, it held on to sacred books that other nations lost. This makes Ethiopia one of the most important protectors of early biblical history. To understand this connection, imagine a moment described in both Ethiopian tradition and the scriptures. The Queen of Sheba traveling to Jerusalem to meet King Solomon. The Western Bible mentions the visit, but only briefly. The Ethiopian tradition gives more detail. It explains that this meeting created a spiritual link that would shape the future of an entire nation. According to ancient Ethiopian writings, Solomon and the Queen of Sheba had a son named Menelik. When Menelik grew older, he traveled to meet his father in Jerusalem. When he returned to Ethiopia, something happened that changed the religious identity of the nation forever. Tradition says that Menelik brought with him the Ark of the Covenant, the most sacred object in Israel's history. Whether one accepts every detail of this story or sees it as symbolic, one thing is certain: Ethiopia believed that God gave it a unique spiritual responsibility. This belief shaped everything that followed. The presence of the Ark, real or symbolic, created a sense of identity that was different from any other ancient kingdom. Ethiopia saw itself not as a secondary nation, but as a direct continuation of the sacred story of Israel. This is why Ethiopia felt responsible for preserving the laws, traditions, and writings that were connected to early faith. This spiritual identity is the foundation of the Ethiopian Bible. It explains why Ethiopia kept the books that Western leaders rejected. Ethiopia did not see these texts as extra material. It saw them as essential parts of its heritage, brought into the nation long before Europe began shaping Christian doctrine. Centuries later, something even more significant happened. Christianity began to spread across the world, but Ethiopia adopted it. Earlier than almost every other nation, while much of the world still followed traditional religions, the Kingdom of Axum embraced Christianity in the 4th century. This was not the result of European missionaries. This was the result of a direct encounter described in the book of Acts, where the Ethiopian eunuch met the apostle Philip. The eunuch brought the message of Jesus back to Ethiopia, and that message took root quickly. Within a short time, Ethiopia became one of the first Christian nations on earth. This early adoption of Christianity gave Ethiopia a unique position. It was not shaped by Rome. It was not shaped by later debate. It developed its Christian identity independently based on the writings it already honored. This independence allowed Ethiopia to preserve books that the Western world eventually removed. The Bible, that was translated into the ancient Ethiopian language known as Ge'ez, contained not only the familiar books of the Old and New Testaments, but also writings that Western councils would later reject. Ethiopia did not see these writings as a threat. It saw them as authentic parts of a much older tradition that connected humanity to the divine. Books like Enoch, Jubilees, the 3 books of Maccabees, and the Ascension of Isaiah were preserved because Ethiopia believed that early believers understood their value. These texts provided context For the spiritual world, the history of the patriarchs, the law given through angels, and the events that shaped Israel long before later interpretations tried to simplify the story. This connection between Ethiopia and ancient Israel did not disappear with time, it grew stronger. While Western Christianity changed through councils, theological conflicts, and political influence, Ethiopia remained anchored to its ancient roots. It did not participate in debates over which books were acceptable. It did not adjust its teachings to fit the needs of empires. Instead, it preserved the Bible that reflected the beliefs of early communities. This preservation gives the Ethiopian Bible a unique value today. It allows us to see the early Christian world through the eyes of those who lived closest to the time of the apostles. It allows us to understand how early believers viewed angels, covenants, prophecy, and divine judgment. And it reveals how the spiritual identity of a nation can survive even when the world around it changes. Ethiopia's connection to biblical history is not just a matter of tradition, it is supported by archaeology, language, and historical records. The ancient Ethiopian language of Ge'ez is one of the oldest biblical languages still in use. The churches carved from solid rock in Lalibela show a dedication to faith that goes back many centuries. The continuous lineage of Ethiopian Christian tradition demonstrates that the nation preserved its beliefs without interruption, even during times of conflict. This long history explains why Ethiopia felt compelled to protect the banned books. These writings were part of its identity, they were part of its understanding of the spiritual world, they were part of the legacy it received from ancient Israel. Understanding this history gives us a different view of the Ethiopian Bible. Many people assume that the Western Bible represents the original form of Scripture, but Ethiopia shows that the earliest form of the Bible was not limited to 66 books. It included more. These books explained the spiritual world in greater detail. They described the interactions between humans and angels. They preserved the early timeline given through divine instruction. They continued the story of prophets who saw visions that extended far beyond the ordinary. When Western leaders removed these books, they did not remove myths. They removed parts of the ancient tradition that once shaped the faith of entire communities. As we continue exploring, it is important to understand one thing clearly. Ethiopia is not a footnote in biblical history. Ethiopia is a central part of it. Its traditions reach back to the days of Solomon. Its early faith reaches back to the time of the apostles. Its Bible reflects the full story that once existed before political decisions changed the way Christianity was practiced in the West. This makes the Ethiopian Bible one of the most important sources for understanding what early believers actually read, believed, and taught. Before we go deeper, I want to ask you to take part in this exploration. If you are still here listening, write the word Ethiopia in the comments so I know you are following the journey with focus and curiosity. And if you wish to continue exploring ancient knowledge with me, feel free to subscribe right now so you stay connected to every new revelation that comes next. Many more discoveries are on the way, and you will not want to miss them. There is a moment in every ancient story when the truth becomes too large, too detailed, or too dangerous for those in power to accept. As centuries passed and Christianity spread into the Roman world, that moment arrived quietly but carried consequences that shaped the future of faith. Hidden inside the history of early Christianity is a turning point that most people never hear about. A turning point where leaders decided which ancient writings would be kept and which would be removed. They did not describe it as censorship, they described it as protection. But when you look closely, you begin to see a pattern. Books that spoke too much about angels were set aside. Books that explained cosmic events in detail were removed. Books that maintained strong connections to ancient Jewish laws were erased, and books that offered alternative explanations of the spiritual world were labeled as dangerous. These decisions shaped the Bible as most people know it today, but these decisions also created a gap, a missing piece of early spiritual knowledge that survived only because Ethiopia refused to let it disappear. The first 30 seconds of this journey matter because they reveal the tension between the visible world and the unseen world. Early believers lived in a time when people accepted the presence of angels, dreams, visions, and supernatural events without hesitation. They believed that the spiritual world was active and involved in human history. But as Christianity spread into political systems, these ideas became more difficult to control. Leaders feared that people might interpret the spiritual world in ways that challenged authority. They feared that some teachings might create disagreements within the growing church. They feared the influence of writings that described the universe in ways that were too complex for the simplified doctrine they wanted to build. As a result, many ancient texts were not rejected for being false. They were rejected for being inconvenient. This is where the story becomes more than history. It becomes a revelation about how faith was shaped. When the church councils began to make decisions, they were not simply gathering information. They were deciding what kind of Christianity would survive. Anything that might confuse believers was removed. Anything that connected too strongly to Jewish traditions was dismissed. Anything that introduced detailed descriptions of angels or the spiritual realm was pushed aside. These decisions created the Bible of 66 books used by most of the world today. But these decisions also removed writings that early communities considered essential. The Ethiopian Bible shows us what Christianity looked like before these changes. It shows us the texts that were considered valuable by the earliest believers, and it gives us insight into why Western leaders were uncomfortable with them. One of the primary reasons many books were banned is that they described the spiritual world with precision. The Book of Enoch, for example, explains the fall of the Watchers, their role in teaching forbidden knowledge to humans, and the origins of corruption that influenced the early world. It describes the judgment of angels and the structure of the heavens. These ideas shaped early Jewish and Christian understanding, yet they later became controversial. Leaders feared that focusing too much on angels or fallen beings would distract believers from the message of salvation. They believed that such detailed descriptions of the unseen realm could lead to speculation or alternative interpretations of theology. Instead of addressing these concerns with clarity, they removed the texts. Another reason books were banned is their strong connection to Jewish law. The Book of Jubilees emphasizes the importance of the Sabbath, dietary practices, and a solar calendar that it claims was given by God. These teachings aligned closely with ancient Jewish customs. But as Christianity spread among non-Jewish populations, early leaders wanted to distance themselves from these traditions. They feared that maintaining these laws would make conversion more difficult. They wanted a universal message that did not depend on ancient rituals. So they removed the books that emphasized these customs, even though they were once respected by early communities. Ethiopia, however, did not share this fear. Ethiopia believed that the laws described in these writings were part of the original covenant and should remain preserved. A third reason these books were banned is that they offered alternative theological ideas. For example, some writings describe different interpretations of the afterlife, cosmic judgment, and the role of angels in human history. Leaders worried that these differences could divide believers. They wanted unity, but unity came at a cost. They removed books that did not match the doctrine they wanted to establish. Ethiopia again took a different path. It continued to preserve these writings because they reflected a faith rooted in ancient tradition, not shaped by political decisions. Behind all of these choices lies a simple truth. The Western Bible did not become what it is by accident. It became what it is because leaders made decisions based on fear, control, and the desire for a stable belief system. This does not mean the familiar Bible is wrong. It means it is incomplete. The Ethiopian Bible preserves the missing pieces. It helps us understand early Christianity in its original form. It gives us access to ideas that most of the world forgot. It shows that the spiritual world was understood in much more detail than modern readers realize. One of the most important factors in the banning of books was the influence of the Roman Empire. Christianity was growing quickly, and leaders wanted a faith that could be controlled and organized. They wanted clear rules. They wanted clear doctrine. They wanted a Bible that was easy to teach and easy to defend. Any book that complicated this goal was removed. Over time, this created a religious structure that was simple enough to spread, but limited in depth. Meanwhile, Ethiopia continued to operate outside of Roman influence. It developed its Christian tradition independently, based on the original writings brought into the country long before Western councils existed. This independence allowed Ethiopia to keep the books that the Western world lost. Another key moment came during the colonial era. European powers, especially Italy, wanted to weaken Ethiopia because of its strong identity. The Ethiopian Bible was seen as a symbol of independence. It represented a connection to ancient truth that did not pass through Europe. This made it a target. Colonial powers wanted Ethiopia to adopt Western religious ideas. They wanted to erase anything that made Ethiopia spiritually unique. But Ethiopia resisted. It continued to preserve the banned books. It refused to replace its traditions. This resistance allowed the lost texts to survive into the modern world. Understanding why these books were banned gives us the ability to see the larger story. It shows us that early Christianity was more diverse and more complex than many people realize. It shows us that ancient believers understood things that modern readers are only now rediscovering. And it shows us that the Ethiopian Bible is not simply another version of Scripture. It is a window into the earliest form of faith. As you reflect on everything revealed here, I want to ask you to write the word awakening in the comments, so I know you are one of the people ready to explore the deeper history behind these decisions. And if you have not done so yet, feel free to subscribe now so you remain part of every new discovery that unfolds as we continue this journey into ancient knowledge and hidden truth. There comes a point in this journey where learning about history is no longer enough. To understand why Ethiopia protected books that other nations removed, we must now step into the writings themselves. These texts are not random stories. They are ancient records that describe supernatural events, visions, laws, and warnings that shaped how early believers understood the world. When you open these books, you are not reading legends. You are reading the thoughts, experiences, and messages of people who believed they had encountered the spiritual realm in ways that most of the modern world has forgotten. The next 30 seconds will take you into writings that influenced early Judaism, early Christianity, and entire civilizations before being pushed into the shadows by leaders who believed they were too powerful or too difficult for ordinary people to understand. Imagine holding a book that describes the origin of angelic rebellion with exact detail. Imagine a text that claims to explain how the world fell into corruption before the flood. Imagine writings that show angels teaching humanity skills that were never meant to be known. These are not imaginary ideas. They are in the Book of Enoch, preserved only because the Ethiopian Bible refused to remove it. When you look at this book, you find descriptions of the Watchers, a group of angels who came to earth and broke divine order. They passed down forbidden knowledge. They created consequences that changed the early world. They caused events that led to the judgment described in Genesis. Enoch recorded these messages long before the flood. His writings were respected by early Jewish communities and early Christians. Even the New Testament quotes Enoch. Yet the Western world removed it because it described too much about angels, their actions, and their judgment. Another book preserved by Ethiopia is the Book of Jubilees. This writing is sometimes called the Lesser Genesis because it retells the stories of creation, the patriarchs, and the early world, but with details that are missing from the Western Bible. Jubilees explains that time was originally measured by a solar calendar, not the lunar system used today. It describes laws taught to Adam, Noah, Abraham, and Jacob by angels. It explains the importance of the Sabbath and purity in ways that connect deeply to ancient Jewish tradition. Western leaders believed these teachings were too connected to Judaism. They worried that keeping these traditions would make Christianity dependent on ancient laws, so they removed the book. Ethiopia did not agree. It believed the writings came from a time when God communicated directly through angels, and that these messages mattered. The Ethiopian Bible also contains the 3 books of Maccabees. Many people in the Western world only know of 2, and even those are often placed in the Apocrypha. But Ethiopia preserved all 3 because they reflect a part of history that shows how faith survives under intense pressure. These books describe the battles and miracles that took place when foreign rulers tried to destroy Jewish worship. They describe families who were willing to die rather than abandon their faith. They describe supernatural interventions that protected the people. These texts show courage, loyalty, and divine protection. Ethiopia considered them essential because they showed how God acted in history to defend those who stayed faithful. Another preserved writing is the Ascension of Isaiah. This text contains one of the earliest Christian descriptions of the heavens. It describes Isaiah's vision as he is taken through multiple levels of the heavenly realm. It shows the ranks of angels and their roles. It describes the plan of the Messiah coming to the world, suffering, and returning to the highest heaven. The vision is detailed and intense. Early Christians used it to understand the nature of the spiritual world and the role of the Messiah. Later leaders removed it because its descriptions of the heavenly realm were too precise, and they feared it would encourage attention on angels rather than doctrine. Ethiopia preserved it because it reflected ancient belief and early Christian tradition. There are also the writings of Baruch and the letter of Jeremiah. These texts come from the same period as the Babylonian exile. They include warnings about idolatry, explanations for the judgment of Israel, and messages of hope if people return to God. They help explain the emotional and spiritual condition of the people during one of the most difficult moments in biblical history. These writings were used by early Jewish communities. They were part of early Christian teaching. But Western leaders removed them because they did not fit into the structure they wanted to build for their canon. Ethiopia preserved them because they completed the historical and spiritual picture of God's relationship with his people. When you examine all these books together, a clear pattern appears. They deal with angels, they explain spiritual laws, they contain visions, they describe prophecy. They reveal events that shaped the early world. These writings are filled with elements that leaders feared would create too much discussion, too many interpretations, or too much focus on supernatural themes. But Ethiopia believed that removing these details would remove part of the truth. Ethiopia believed that people needed to understand the full story. Ethiopia believed that knowledge of the ancient world was important for understanding God's purpose and the structure of the universe. The banned books give us access to a time when the spiritual and physical worlds were understood as connected. They show us how early believers saw angels not as distant beings, but as active participants in the history of humanity. They show us how corruption entered the world, not only through human decisions, but through spiritual rebellion. They show us that ancient people believed that time, law, and prophecy were given through divine instruction. They show us that early communities lived with a strong awareness of God's presence and the actions of His messengers. These writings take us back to that worldview, and once you see them, it becomes clear why Ethiopia fought so hard to preserve them. Understanding these books also helps explain why they were removed. They challenge simple interpretations. They require deeper thought. They show a much bigger picture of the universe. They show a story that is more complex than what many people learn today. For some leaders, this complexity was a threat. For Ethiopia, it was truth. Before we continue into the next stage of this exploration, I want to ask something simple so I know you are still here with focus. Write the word hidden in the comments if you believe these ancient writings should be known by the world again. And if you want to stay connected to every new part of this journey, feel invited to subscribe right now so you remain with us as we reveal more of what was lost for centuries. There comes a point in this journey where the ancient texts no longer feel like history, but like warnings. As you move deeper into the writings preserved in the Ethiopian Bible, you begin to see something unusual. These books do not only describe the past, they speak about events that were believed to repeat themselves in cycles. They describe spiritual forces that continue to act in the world. They describe the end of one age and the beginning of another. Most importantly, they describe prophecies that continue to raise important questions today. When you read them, you cannot avoid one thought. Did early believers know something that the modern world ignores? The first 30 seconds of this exploration are important because they open this possibility. They show that the Ethiopian texts may not only be ancient memories, they may be messages for the present. One of the strongest themes you find in these preserved writings is the idea that the world is influenced not only by human choices, but by spiritual forces. Books like Enoch, Isaiah's vision, and Jubilees describe angels who act, fallen beings who interfere, and a cosmic struggle between good and evil that continues through time. These writings explain that the world is not random. They say that there is order in the universe, and that this order is challenged by beings who rebelled long ago. According to these books, the events of the past did not close the story. The same spiritual tensions continue today. Early communities believed that the same forces that acted in ancient times would rise again at the end of the age. In the book of Enoch, the judgment of the fallen angels is described with detail. These angels acted long before the flood, but the text says their influence remains until the final judgment. They caused violence, corruption, and confusion in the world. They passed forbidden knowledge to humans. They disrupted natural order. Enoch describes their destiny, but the text also says that the final judgment is connected to the last days of humanity. This connection has caused many people throughout history to wonder if the signs of the end are visible in the present world. When you read the descriptions of widespread violence, moral confusion, and global tension in Enoch, it becomes difficult to ignore how similar they are to the modern world. The Ascension of Isaiah contains its own set of visions. It describes a spiritual conflict where the forces of darkness try to stop the mission of the Messiah. It describes that evil will grow stronger before the final judgment. It explains that deception will spread. It warns that many people will lose spiritual awareness. These messages were powerful when they were written, but they feel even more meaningful today. The descriptions of growing division, spiritual confusion, and global instability are similar to many of the challenges the world faces now. Whether a person sees these writings as prophecy or as spiritual guidance, they are impossible to ignore. The Book of Jubilees also adds something important. It explains that the original laws given to humanity were meant to keep people aligned with divine order. It says that when people abandon these laws, disorder enters the world. It says that the further humanity moves away from the original instructions, the more chaos increases. Many people today question why the world seems increasingly unstable. Jubilees suggests that the answer lies in the rejection of divine patterns. It argues that humanity loses spiritual protection when it breaks away from the principles that were given at the beginning of creation. This idea challenges modern beliefs, but reflects a worldview that was once widespread in early communities. These texts also describe natural signs that would appear during the end of the age. Enoch mentions disturbances in the heavens, changes in the natural world, and increasing conflict among nations. Isaiah's vision warns about rising deception and spiritual blindness. Jubilees explains that time itself will seem disrupted because humanity will not follow the original calendar. When you compare these ideas with the modern world, many people see parallels. Extreme natural events, global conflict, moral confusion, and rapid change are all part of today's reality. Whether a person interprets this spiritually or historically, the similarity is striking. What makes these writings even more important is that they were preserved in a place where they were never erased or edited. Ethiopia protected them because it believed they contained knowledge that would matter in the future. This belief has existed for centuries. According to Ethiopian tradition, these texts were preserved not only for the past, but for future generations who would need them. Ethiopia saw itself as a guardian, not only of history, but of warnings. And when you read the content of these books, this belief begins to make sense. They speak about cycles. They speak about returning patterns. They speak about a final period when hidden things will become known again. For many people today, spiritual awareness is becoming more important. Questions about the unseen world are increasing. People want to understand what is happening in the world and why. The banned books offer explanations and patterns that many modern writings cannot provide. They show that early believers had a much deeper understanding of spiritual conflict. They show that the unseen world influenced nations, leaders, and events. They show that prophecy was not only about the future, but about understanding the structure of reality. The Ethiopian Bible brings all of this forward. It offers access to writings that survived because Ethiopia did not allow them to disappear. It gives the modern world a chance to reconnect with knowledge that once shaped entire civilizations. Whether a person believes these writings are literal, symbolic, or spiritual, their impact is undeniable. They ask the reader to consider the world differently. They ask the reader to see history as part of a larger timeline. They ask the reader to understand that spiritual and physical events are connected. As we continue to explore these texts, I want to know how you are connecting with this information. Write the word prophecy in the comments so I can see who is truly following this investigation with attention. And if you want to stay with me as we uncover even more from these ancient writings, feel free to subscribe now so you do not miss the next revelations that will continue unfolding step by step. There comes a moment at the end of every search when the information in front of you no longer feels like history, but like a mirror that shows you the world as it is, the world as it was, and the world as it may soon become. Reaching this point in the journey through the Ethiopian Bible means more than learning facts. It means recognizing that something has been calling across time, something preserved for thousands of years, waiting for people willing to look deeper than surface-level explanations. You have walked step by step through ancient writings, spiritual warnings, lost histories, hidden books, and forgotten truths. But now, here at the final part, you stand in a place where all these elements come together. This is where the purpose becomes clear, and this clarity begins in the first 30 seconds of what you are about to hear. For generations, people wondered why some texts survived and others disappeared. They wondered why Ethiopia, a single nation on the edge of ancient empires, guarded books that others banned. They wondered why early communities spoke about angels, visions, cosmic battles, and prophecies that most people today never hear. When you reach this moment, the answer finally reveals itself. These books were not protected by accident. They were preserved because they carried knowledge that would matter in a time when the world would face confusion, conflict, and spiritual silence. They were kept because someone in the ancient world believed that future generations would need them. And now, as people around the world search for meaning in uncertain times, these writings rise again. The more you explore them, the more you see a pattern that is impossible to ignore. The early believers who used these books understood that life is not shaped only by human decisions. They understood that there are forces that act beyond what the eye can see. They believed that the spiritual world is active and organized. They believed that angels protect, warn, and guide. They believed that fallen beings interfere with human history. They believed that prophecy is not a prediction, but a message that shows how the universe works. These ideas may feel unusual in the modern world, but in the ancient world, they were normal. And Ethiopia kept this worldview alive, even when the rest of the world moved away from it. As you read the preserved writings, you begin to understand why they were so important. They show what the early world looked like before the flood. They show how the first families understood God. They show how the angels acted. They show the warnings that came from the heavens. They show the purpose behind laws, covenants, and time itself. They show patterns that repeat through history. They show the conflict that has continued since the beginning. These texts reveal that the ancient world was not simple. It was complex. It was active. It was filled with spiritual events that shaped the entire story of humanity. What makes this even more emotional is that these books almost disappeared. They were almost lost forever. They survived because one nation refused to let them be erased. Ethiopia carried them through invasions, war, colonization, political pressure, and cultural change. Even when powerful nations tried to remove Ethiopia's identity, the texts remained. They were read, they were copied, they were guarded, they were treasured as part of an ancient covenant. This act of preservation is not only historical, it is spiritual. It shows that truth can survive even when the world tries to silence it. When you step back and look at the entire journey, you see something that most people never understand. The Ethiopian Bible is not only a collection of books, it is a witness to a time when the spiritual world was acknowledged, a witness to messages that were once accepted by people who walked with prophets and apostles. A witness to a form of Christianity that existed before councils and politics changed it. A witness to warnings that may be meant for our time. A witness to a faith that survived untouched for thousands of years. This is why reading these texts can create a feeling that is difficult to describe. It is not fear, it is not confusion, it is awareness. You begin to see that the world we live in is connected to a much older story. You begin to understand that the events we see today are not random. They are part of cycles that the ancient writings describe. You begin to recognize that the struggles, questions, and signs in the modern age were already known by people who lived long before us. You begin to feel that the hidden books were preserved not only to explain the past, but to prepare people for the future. As you reach the final moments of this journey, the question becomes personal. What do you do with this knowledge? How do you respond to the realization that the world has overlooked something that early believers considered essential? For many people, the first step is curiosity. For others, it is reflection. For some, it is a sense of urgency. But for anyone who has listened to this entire journey, something has changed. You cannot go back to seeing the world in the same simple way. The ancient writings open your understanding. They place the familiar Bible in a larger context. They restore lost information. They show new layers of meaning. And they invite you to see that your own spiritual life is connected to something much older than you realized. This final part is not an ending. It is the beginning of a new exploration. There are still many texts, mysteries, and prophecies inside the Ethiopian tradition that can be uncovered. There are still questions about the Watchers, the early world, the solar calendar, the visions, the angels, and the final judgment. There are still connections between ancient writings and events happening today. There are still messages that may help people understand the spiritual conflict that continues throughout history. And there are still discoveries waiting for those who want to go deeper than the surface. If you have traveled all the way through this journey, you are someone who seeks truth, someone who listens beyond what is commonly taught, someone who wants to understand the full picture. And for people like you, this is only the beginning. There is much more to explore, much more to uncover, much more to understand. The hidden books are open again. Their message is reaching the world, and the next steps will reveal even more knowledge that has been forgotten for centuries. Thank you for staying with this entire investigation. If you want to continue receiving content like this and be part of the next discoveries, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss what comes next.